Good evening. I recently learned about a Soviet murderer back in the 1930s named Alexander Labutkin. And I thought it was kind of interesting, so I figured I'd read you an article about him. This article is in bigpicture.ru. Uh, it's a history site, but the title of the article is Alexander Labutkin, the one-armed bandit who kept all of Leningrad in fear. I've translated this using Google Translate. Leningrader Alexander Labutkin is often called a maniac, but that is not entirely true. This scoundrel was driven not by an irresistible passion to torture and kill, but by a thirst for profit and a sense of superiority over others. Despite his disability, he easily dealt with his victims as he was a master of firearms. Labutkin's victims were 12 people. He would have continued his bloody harvest, but he became a hostage of love and received a bullet in the back of the head himself. Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of a... I've read a couple of different articles about him. They disagree somewhat on some of the details, but we will proceed. Young disabled worker. Alexander Alexeyevich Labutkin was born in 1910 to a very ordinary working-class family from St. Petersburg. His father worked at the Krasnoznamenets arms factory, devoting 42 years of his life to it. Nothing is known about his mother. Alexander grew up as an ordinary boy, not standing out among his peers. He was not a good student, so after finishing school, he immediately went to work as an apprentice at his father's factory. At the enterprise specializing in the production of small arms, Labutkin quickly found himself. After working a little in different workshops, he got a prestigious position as a gunner. His duties included testing the accuracy of Nagant revolvers and their subsequent adjustment. Daily shooting exercise made him a real sniper out of the young man. Well, pistolier anyway. By the way, I have here an example of the Nagant revolver. Model of 1895. This particular one was made in Tula in 1932. Double and single action, caliber 7.62 by 38 millimeter rimmed. Daily shooting exercise made him a real sniper out of the young man. Labutkin shot without a miss from both one and two revolvers simultaneously. Who knows what would have happened to the skilled worker if not for an accident? In 1930, Labutkin decided to expand his vegetable garden and remove several trees. Considering himself a progressive and daring person, Alexander decided to call on technology to help. He took pyroxylin, an explosive substance, from the factory and hoped to use it to remove the trees by the roots. An experienced shooter but a lousy demolitionist, Labutkin placed the explosives in the right place, lit the fuse, and walked away. But the detonator did not work. Then he decided to check the charge and went to the tree. At that moment, an explosion occurred, tearing off Alexander's right hand. For a shooter, this is a real catastrophe because the right hand is his main working tool. And here we have an illustration of the workshop in Leningrad plant, Krasnoznamenets, in the 1930s. Labutkin was fired from the plant due to disability and was assigned a pension due to an industrial injury. It is unknown how this wording came about. Perhaps his father's connections helped, or perhaps the story with the tree is not entirely true. But the fact is that at the age of 20, Alexander became disabled. Labutkin could do nothing but shoot, and he faced the prospect of a miserable life and a small pension. On a slippery slope. But the young man decided not to give up and start all over again. On the recommendation of the Komsomol organization, he got a job at the Okhtinsky chemical plant. There he mastered a new specialty as a steam pipe fitter, a specialist in the repair and maintenance of main lines through which steam is supplied. But in his new place, Labutkin, who loved to dress well and carouse at parties, was catastrophically short of money. Everything worsened after Alexander met Maria, a girl with whom he decided to start a family. Alexander's chosen one was 3 years younger than him, but much more experienced in life. She had failed to finish school, but she had already had a criminal record for theft. Like Labutkin, Maria loved luxury and noisy parties, and this is what pushed her to commit a crime. This did not bother the young worker. He was so similar to her. Alexander tried his best to seem successful and sophisticated in life. My tripod's not being very cooperative. He walked around Leningrad in a good suit and a wide-brimmed gangster-style hat, and he was known in all the restaurants in the city center. When you are an ordinary steam pipe worker, you should forget about luxury. Labutkin was driven crazy by financial problems. The only activity that helped relieve nervous tension was shooting a revolver. The one-armed man managed to get a weapon with the help of a former colleague from the plant. The other article I read disagreed somewhat here. It was in that article, I believe, it was mentioned that it was actually a friend of his father who had been working there since Tsarist times, who had been basically collecting Nagan parts as well as cartridges. And this weapon is unloaded, by the way. It does have some empty cases in it. But, you know, as well as cases for the revolver. See, it's empty. It's not loaded. None of them have it. I've already safety checked them. I just use those as dry fire snap caps. Basically, the old man had squirreled away a number of parts for the revolvers and set up a little workshop upon retirement. And he would sell these weapons illegally. The Soviet Union had very strict gun control laws, so acquiring weapons was very difficult for civilians, if not impossible, particularly handguns. But, you know, as Ian Malcolm says, life finds a way. So back to the article. He managed to get the weapon with the help of former colleagues at the plant. In his free time, he went into the forest and shot at cans with homemade cartridges. Labutkin learned to make them himself, replacing a standard bullet with a ball bearing ground to size and shape. Series of murders. It was during one of these forays that Labutkin committed his first crime. On the afternoon of August 29, 1933, he was walking in the Pundalovsky forest outside the city limits. Mushroom pickers, a worker from the Leningrad plant Promet, and his wife were walking towards the armed Alexander along the path. When they passed each other, Labutkin turned and fired twice. Each bullet hit the victim in the head. The former specialist in weapons accuracy knew how to shoot. Labutkin's loot was modest. The killer took the woman's jacket and the man's boots. In addition, there was some change in the couple's pockets. The killer also took a basket of mushrooms. He brought them home and told his wife to fry them for dinner. That same day, Alexander went to the plant for the night shift as if nothing had happened. Later, investigators would note that the killer operated exclusively in the morning and in the afternoon. This was due to the fact that the disabled Labutkin was assigned to work mainly on quiet night shifts. The next morning, on his way from the factory, Labutkin again turned into the Pundalovsky forest. There he took the weapon from its hiding place and went to look for new victims along the paths. Unfortunately, his hunt was successful that day as well. He met 3 engineers, 2 men and a woman, who had come to the forest to pick mushrooms, which is a popular activity in Russia. The killer killed them all with 3 shots and began searching the corpses. This time he was luckier. He got 3 raincoats, boots, a wristwatch, and some money. But Labutkin did not notice that the woman was alive. When he disappeared, the wounded woman began to call for help and was soon found. The victim was placed in the hospital, and armed guards were assigned to her ward. Everyone hoped that the woman would soon be able to give evidence and describe the killer, But this did not happen. Soon after arriving in the clinic, she lost consciousness and died. One-armed bandit. After the second group murder, nasty rumors began to spread around Leningrad. They said that Satan himself had come to the city and that the end of the world would soon come. Many linked the deaths with divine punishment sent for the destruction of churches and monasteries by the Bolsheviks. The police investigators looked at the case more soberly, but they were also following the wrong path. They decided that the killer was hunting for one of the group and killed the rest as witnesses. The commotion scared Labutkin, and he went into hiding and did not take the revolver out of its hiding place until winter. The other article mentions that there was a number of police and actually army patrols in the forest looking for the killer. And that's why he went into hiding. But on December 2nd, 1933, Alexander could not stand it any longer and went deep into the forest again. There he encountered a peasant couple. The husband and wife were riding in a cart through the forest along the highway and chatting quietly. They were returning with purchases from one of the Leningrad markets to their village. Labutkin dealt with the couple without hesitation, and having driven the cart into the forest, began to plunder. This time the loot was even more generous. In addition to the blood-stained sheepskin coats, the scoundrel got new felt boots, a basket of fish, 7 kilograms of flour and cereal, and 85 rubles. The other article mentioned that the average monthly wage for a worker was about 125 rubles at the time. Alexander ordered his wife Maria, who was aware of her husband's escapades at the time, to sell the felt boots. After yet another daring murder, the Leningrad region police joined the search for the criminals. Patrols were stepped up in the area where the shooter was operating, and locals were questioned. They tried to catch him with live bait. Policemen with weapons, dressed in civilian clothes, wandered through the forest. An unprecedented step was also taken. In order to catch the killer, several dozen repressed detectives were released from the gulags. This being detectives that had worked for the Tsarist regime, who'd been rotting away in the gulags ever since the revolution, were released to try to find the murderer. Though the other article does say that detectives were released and some were assigned to this, they suggest that this was also in connection with the assassination of Kirov. But it was all in vain. The villain did not make himself known until April of 1934. Labutkin went hunting again when the law enforcement officers relaxed their vigilance. Decoy duck. But now Alexander Labutkin became much more cautious. He took his wife as an accomplice so that she would lure victims to a secluded place. On April 11th of 1934, in the already well-known Pundalovsky forest, the killer shot and robbed a worker. The unfortunate man received his salary and was walking home when a young woman called out to him. It was Maria Labutkina, posing as a girl of low morals. She suggested that the man have a good time and invited him to go off the road into the thicket for this purpose. Of course, instead of lovemaking, the one-armed gunman with a revolver was waiting for them in the bushes. That day, the couple got a hold of 150 rubles, a set of metalworking tools, and gold crowns that he pried out of the dead man's teeth. After this murder, patrols were increased again and Labutkin went into hiding again. He waited until November of 1934, but then realized that his beloved Pundalovsky forest would no longer be a quiet hunting ground. Labutkin decided to continue his robbery in the Utkinsky forest, now located in the Vyborg district. One day, Labutkin killed a janitor who was enjoying his hobby in the forest. The victim was checking his traps for birds when the killer crept up to him within shooting distance. The loot was insignificant: worn-out boots, a couple of rubles, and caught birds in traps. But Alexander did not pick and choose and took everything home. Incidentally, the birds were very much liked by the criminal's mother-in-law, in whose house the killer and his wife lived. Yes, the mother-in-law also knew very well what her son-in-law and daughter were doing. Fatal love. Before falling into the hands of justice, Alexander Labutkin killed 4 more people. There could have been 5 victims, but the killer made a fatal mistake. On March 18, 1935, he met a couple in love. A waiter from one of the Leningrad restaurants and his girlfriend were walking arm in arm through the forest. The shooter killed the man with 1 bullet, but only slightly wounded the girl. Impressed by the beauty of the stranger, Labutkin sexually assaulted her and let her go. But finally, he invited her on a date the very next day. According to one version, the victim contacted the police herself. According to another, her story was told to a law enforcement by her close friend. Since it became known that the serial killer was missing his right hand, the search did not last long. The next day, a search was conducted in Alexander's house. There they found the belongings of the murdered men, which the criminals decided to keep for themselves, and 3 hunting rifles. But the presence of the guns meant nothing. The police needed to find a revolver, the only murder weapon used by the one-armed bandit. Incidentally, the other article mentions that the police had deduced that it was a revolver as opposed to a semi-automatic handgun by the absence of spent casings at any of the crime scenes. One could say that the Nagant revolver would have been the most common handgun in Russia at the time, and they would be correct, but it was certainly not the only handgun. There would also have been, Mauser broom handles, which also were 7.62 millimeter, as well as a number of FN Browning pistols as well in various cartridges. So the ball bearings bit, that would have made, casings aside, that would have made it very difficult for an automatic pistol to cycle. But they guessed correctly. It was them a gun. But they searched for the murder weapon for the entire day, but the revolver was nowhere to be found. Labutkin refused to answer questions, but still gave himself away. One of the detectives noticed that the arrested man was occasionally glancing at the radio receiver on the table. When they took it apart, they found a revolver and homemade cartridges inside. Labutkin and his wife were not the only ones in the dock. His mother-in-law, who knew about the murders, the mechanic who supplied the killer with the revolver, and even a neighbor also had to answer. The latter, as it turned out, knew what the family was doing but kept quiet. The accomplices were given between 5 and 20 years in the Gulag camps. The one-armed bandit himself could not count on leniency. Labutkin was sentenced to death for 12 murders. The sentence was carried out in the same year of 1935. Around the same time as Labutkin, incidentally, another unusual killer named the Sverdlovsk Monster was operating in the USSR. But that's a story for another time. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm not necessarily a true crime buff, but I do like occasionally reading stuff like this. I am a big fan of Russian history and the news over there. Much of it happens to be fairly dark, but there you go. Hope you have a good night.